Hey everybody, welcome to the first part of the making of Planet Coaster. And just to clarify, by that I don't mean the game itself, but a roller coaster which I made in the game and released a couple of days ago. Thankfully I saved some time lapses of it, because I got so many requests to turn this into a how it's made type of series, that I figured I could take these time lapses and actually make this two-part video series out of it. And in this series I'll just show you how I made the coaster itself, how I made the planet that it revolves around, and how I constructed the entire idea that somehow it's out there up in space, when in reality it's all just in-game, or most of it is at least. So without further ado, let's get into the time-lapse. So of course the thing that I had to start with is making the planet itself. And I did this in a way which is very straightforward, but in hindsight I think there could have been easier ways if you want to do this yourself. One thing which you could do is actually make a perfect sphere out of scenery and then terraform around that. In this case though, I just decided to take the terraforming tool only and just work on a sphere, just carefully changing some things here and there until it looks like a perfect enough sphere. It's definitely not perfect in the end, but with a lot of smoothing and trial and error to get all of the bumps out there, it's more or less enough of a ball to turn it into an actual planet. The characteristic that I feel matters most about the planet is the size of it. I wanted to make sure that it was large enough to actually seem like an actual microscopic planet and large enough to fit some buildings and trees on without said buildings and trees completely dwarfing the planet itself, while at the same time making it small enough to realistically, well, not really realistically, but to allow me to actually build a coaster around it. If it were much larger, it'd be hard to have the coaster revolve around the planet without losing too much speed, and also it would take much more time to do this entire project. And in the end, I think in-game it took around 20 hours spread over 2 days, as it was just a small Christmas vacation kind of project, and I'm actually really happy with how little time it took this build, and most of my time was actually spent in sort of creating the illusion that it's much more than it really is, when in reality it's just a floating bubble of terraforming with a bunch of trees around it. So going almost into the coaster layout here, I was pretty confident that I could make the coaster layout in the way that I wanted, since the sphere is quite small. Because the way that I wanted to make the coaster layout is in that kind of confusing way, where it's not quite clear what's up and what's down. Because obviously this planet being in space, you kind of do want to get rid of the idea that there's up and down at all. And this was very challenging. I didn't really have any kind of planning before I went into making this layout, because I had no clue how to prepare for making a coaster layout around a super small planet. It's not exactly something that I've done before. But the one thing that I did want to make sure I did with this layout is to make the riders lose their orientation, and that's why I decided that it would be best to make this layout out of large sweeping curves that don't change their direction too much and mostly stay very close to the ground of the planet itself. And you can see this in the first curve already, though the only reason why it goes completely to the bottom of the planet is because I wanted to start off the ride with the zero-G roll, already like lose all of your orientation of what exactly is where, since during that entire zero-G roll it starts going inverted already, which is already kind of confusing, since the zero-G roll of course banks 360 degrees, but after those 360 degrees you're upside down, which is already kind of weird, and that is more or less the parting shot for this entire station thing that you're coming out of. And you also already make quite a bit of speed during that. But after that first curve coming up again, I wanted to make the small upwards launching LIM launch parts, just to make sure that you don't lose your momentum. I wanted to make the entire ride quite fast, and it's a pretty easy way to make it, just to make the coaster not lose any speed, and to make sure that it can stay close to the planet itself at all times. And also, one thing that I wanted to make sure with this is that it has enough speed at the end to make its way back to the station without having to add another lift hill to the top of the planet, because that would obviously disrupt any idea that there is no up and down on this planet. So that was quite important, and then after that LIM launch, I figured I would have a section of the coaster with two very large sweeping curves and we're working on the second one over here. And basically what I wanted to do with this is have these curves that are mostly horizontal, because one thing that obviously gives away what's the bottom and what's the top of this planet is the fact that the cars will always gravitate toward the bottom of the planet. So I wanted to have some curves that seem like they're horizontal curves, but are actually kind of diagonal curves, and the cars don't really accelerate too much over the course of these curves to make it very obvious where up and down is. At least that's what I was going for, and I hope I kind of succeeded in that. And instead the cars just have a very even, fast speed, going very close to the planet. And then the final two elements are these large helixes, which are almost exactly vertical, which kind of make it seem as if the vertical side of this planet is actually horizontal. These are technically just loops, but they're banked outward to make it seem as if they are helixes. And one of the things which kind of helped with this idea is these little airtime hills that aren't actually airtime hills, they're actually hills that extend outward and would give some lethal G's in real life. But in this case it kind of makes it look as if the ending of the ride is a bunch of helixes with airtime hills, and that basically concludes the ride, which has three basic parts, I'd say, with the first part being the 0G rolls and the launch section, the second one being those large sweeping curves where it's hard to tell on what side of the planet you are really at, and the last part being those two helixes. And after that I wanted to move into making the station of the coaster, and this was all just a lot of stuff that I was winging at the time. I didn't really think it was too important to get into the designs of the station and the other castle at this point. The only thing that I had prepared for myself was that I wanted to have two castles on this planet. The reason why I wanted to have two is because one castle would very easily give away what's the top and what's the bottom of the castle, and exactly remove that suspense of disbelief that this is an actual planet. So I wanted to have two castles, and this also gives the planet a very nice kind of duality structure to it. It actually seems a lot like yin-yang if I look back at it, with one side, you know, this being the daytime side, and the other side being the nighttime side, and they're both kind of separated by these large sweeping curves of the coaster itself, which is very interesting. But there's definitely a duality in the planet in that sense, not just because it looks good, but also because it removes the idea that, you know, there's up and down. It just makes it seem more like you can go anywhere on this thing. And because there's such a duality between the two halves of the planet, I also wanted to make sure that these two castles are similar in a way, but also very distinct. So the top castle here, I wanted to mostly use the domes in the game and make it more of a wide building than it really is tall. So it's mostly just characterized by this very large dome, which sits just on top of the station. And then there's of course the domed kind of onion tower right next to it, which it was looking a lot like a mosque at this point, which is something that I did kind of want to avoid. I just wanted to make it look a bit more neutral, kind of fantasy-esque. So I hope with adding a lot of these different gothic elements to it around all of the detailings, especially the windows and the doors and the arches, that it's a bit less pinpointable to any kind of location or inspiration. It's really just a castle for the sake of there being a castle on top of the planet. And I also put these battlements on the side, or they're not called battlements, the battlements are the things on top of the walls. I put these buttresses on the side of the building, which are a bit of a gothic touch as well. They're really just for fun because they don't actually support anything and they're structurally completely illogical, but it's a nice touch of detail that I wanted to add into the station. I mean, it's not like this build is very logical to begin with. And that aside, I'm actually using a surprising amount of just simple in-game elements and not really making anything myself, since I didn't want to spend too much time on this castle. It's not really a focus to make the castle look as detailed or intricate or unique itself. It's really just a build that I wanted to have on top of this planet to shape the look of the planet as a whole. So it's quite simple. And I put a bunch of rocks and foliage around it to detail it and blend it in a little bit with the rest of the planet as well. What was a little bit tricky about the castle is that it doesn't actually move with the curvature of the planets. It's completely vertical for the entire thing, but around the castle, the trees, as you can see, are already starting to curve toward the curvature of the planets, since I wanted to follow the direction that the planet is going with all of the trees to make it look even more as if there's no actual up and down and everything is really just sprouting from the planet itself. But it does look a little bit weird, I feel, very close to the castle here, since you can already see the trees curving out in this ridiculous sense, which doesn't really make any sense. Now that I haven't even talked about that yet, by the way, I just want to very quickly say that there was a lot of Mario Galaxy inspiration definitely in this, and as you can probably tell with the castle right now especially, there is definitely some inspiration from the first Galaxy in Mario Galaxy, where you also have this kind of castle that you're starting out with, and of course you have all of these very small planetoids with weird gravity and everything just coming out of these very small planets that somehow have the same gravitational pull that the Earth has, which makes no sense, but it's an amazing concept, and that's definitely where I took a lot of inspiration from, other than of course just the name of the game, because obviously actually, that's not quite as obvious. I came up with the title for this coaster before I made the coaster itself. I just wanted to make a coaster called Planet Coaster and themed after a planet for such a long time because it's the name of the game, and I just thought it would be funny to do it. So here you go. That's basically the reason why I made this thing in the first place. Now, another thing that was very tough, actually my main challenge with this coaster, was the supports. If I were to let the game make all of the supports for this coaster, they would just go straight to the Earth, and that would be a huge problem. But what also proved to be a problem is that you're not allowed to intersect the scenery with the coaster track. So none of the supports actually touch the coaster. I tried to get as close as I could with making all of these custom supports and get them to almost intersect the coaster track, but at no point do the supports even touch the track. There is always a super small distance between the supports and the track, so it's not actually technically supported. I just needed to get all of these supports in to create the illusion of everything being pulled toward the planet, which I have here. These supports are also the reason why the track isn't really longer than it is, since custom supporting on its own is already quite challenging, with not being able to put the supports into the coaster track. But with these supports, I also had to make sure that every support goes directly into the center of the planet, so it took a lot of trial and error to get all of these supports to go into the right direction and actually supports the coaster in a way that would make sense if this planet actually had a gravitational pull. So yeah, in the end, that meant making a lot of these different supports, and I cut out a lot of the support making from the time-lapse because I think it's just a bit of a boring thing. It's something I had to do, but nothing that really defines the coaster. The only case in which I would say I think that the supports are very defining in a sort of scenery kind of purpose is for the tallest points. The first 0G roll has some supports that always stick out from the planet, and you can see very clearly. And the same goes for the 0G roll that launches over the station, which has some tall supports which kind of fit a scenery kind of purpose. They just make it seem even more like it's a small planet, and it's a small planet with actual gravity. But that aside, these supports were more of a nuisance than an actual fun bit of making this coaster. So I was just really happy to be done with these supports in the end. Speaking of the end, by the way, that's also the end of this episode. Thank you guys for watching so far, and stay tuned for the next video in which I'll show you how I finished the planet itself and made the space around the planet in video editing as well.